As we continue our Devo on the characteristics of God, we had Pastor Steve talk about creation. And in Genesis 1 and 2, we see the beautiful story of creation happen. And then in Genesis 3, the fall happens. And the fall is where all of humanity fell into sin and the world was forever changed in the place it was. But in that, there was a promise. And this is God's promise. And that's my focus today. My focus today is on the characteristic of God's promises. And this chart that you see before you is a creation of Dr. Charles Bayless from Dallas Theological Seminary. And in that, we see God's way as well as the serpent's way. And in Genesis 1 and 2, we have creation. We have Genesis 3, which goes into the fall. But in that fall, we have the promise of Genesis 3:15, where it says that God will put animosity between the offspring or the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And through the seed of the woman, a restoration will happen. And this is the promise of Genesis 3:15, is that God will bring restoration. And as we see scripture keep moving forward, we see that the seed continues with Cain and Abel. And so Adam and Eve are looking with hope. But then the murder happens and they fall back into sin. But then again, we see an upswing with Seth. The offspring, the seed continues. The seed of this promise of the return and the promise of restoration continues. And we see the seed continues in Genesis 12 with a promise with Abraham and Isaac, with Abraham becoming Israel as a nation. And now the seed is to come through a nation. But the seed can never quite reach back to creation because they fall short again. Israel sins, as seen in the book of Judges. And they even demand a king ahead of God's timeline for their own timeline, for their own selfish gains. But in 2 Samuel 7:16, we see that the seed becomes a king. The seed equals a king. And this is seen through King David. And this brings hope to the Israelite people. But then we see David sins with Bathsheba. And he murders and he betrays and he lies. And so again, David cannot be the seed either. But then we also see good kings come after David. And this brings hope to Israel. But then we also see the swing of bad kings and the things like the exile and the Babylonian times, where the restoration feels like it can't be completed. And this continues all the way through the Old Testament. And in Isaiah 43, it talks about the way of the Lord is coming. And there was one who will come before him who will prepare the way, which we know from reading is John the Baptist. But in that, we begin to recognize the seed is also a king. The seed is the Lord. He is a promise made at the very beginning. He's coming from a nation of Israel. He is a king, and he is a Lord. And then when we come across Matthew 1, this genealogy that tends to seem like just a lot of names together, it becomes something unique. Because what it does is it says the seed is Jesus. This seed of promise, this seed of restoration, all the way back in that lineage, all the way back to Abraham and Isaac, who came from Adam and Eve. This seed is Jesus. The ultimate promise of God's restoration of the world, which happened all the way down in Genesis 3:15, has now been completed ultimately in Jesus. And that's how we can see God's promise work. God's promise is that ultimately his plans will work out. Ultimately, things will work out for the way that he measures. But notice the trend here. The trend is God creates something good, but then man does evil, and it falls into chaos. It falls into destruction. But realize that never undid God's promises. That never actually stopped what God could do. It didn't matter if man or nations or things were done in evil that seemed to destroy things. God's promise of restoration always continued. no matter how deeply man fell into sin. And that's the hope we can take too, is that the characteristic of a God in his promises is that he is not interrupted by anything we're going through. He's not interrupted by job loss. He's not interrupted by pandemics. He's not interrupted by relationships falling apart. He's not interrupted by death. He's not interrupted by sickness, because God's ultimate plan of restoration will always continue, and God always knows how to take anything and turn it into a place to glorify him.